My talk today is on inclusive classroom communication. Yet another way that we might conceptualize differences is to think about the different ways that people prefer to process information. So to help us think about this, I have a little bit of an activity for you to get you out of your chairs early this morning. So I'll be giving you a multiple choice question that's drawn from the VARK inventory. And VARK stands for visual, auditory, reading and writing, and kinesthetic or hands-on. And VARK is a number of learning inventories about learning styles that are available. To illustrate what these inventories are trying to show about different learning styles, I'm going to read a question and ask you to think about it and then stand up if you are able to for the choice or choices you would be most comfortable with. And you can look around after each choice as well to notice the differences in how many people stand up for each option. And I want to emphasize that multiple choices are okay here, so if you can stand more than once for the question, if you're able, that's totally fine. So this question taken from the VARK inventory, I think, is probably familiar to all of us. You are about to learn a new program on a computer, or a smartphone, I guess. You would, and I'll ask people again to stand if you're able, if you would sit down at the keyboard and experiment, just play. Wow, that's like almost everyone in the room. Okay, awesome, thank you. You can have a seat. And then the next option would be reading the manual. These are the people I so admire, the manual readers. Okay, so you can notice the differences here in how many people stood up for those two. It's quite a number fewer who would read the manual. Find someone to explain it to you. Okay, so this is about roughly a third of the room. I would have stood up for that one if I wasn't already standing. And lastly, you'd rely on pictures or diagrams in some kind of tutorial, like a YouTube tutorial or something. Okay, so quite a number of visual people here, so thank you. Hopefully got to stretch your legs a little bit with this activity. In looking around the room, what struck me were the considerable differences that we noticed here. And you will definitely notice that your students express preferences for different modes of learning. So while these learning style inventories are really helpful for thinking about the different ways that we process information, the research on learning actually shows that individuals learn best if they're given opportunities to learn and process through multiple modalities. So I already heard some people chuckling, but this Onion article is entitled "Parents of Nasal Learners Demand Odor-Based Curriculum." And this article, which is quite funny to read the whole thing, it really pokes fun at the idea that you have to match student preferences in learning in order to help them to learn. So those of you that stood up for more than one response, you were onto something. The research in cognitive psychology actually suggests that using a combination of spoken text, written text, and visuals is the best way to help students process information, and that hands-on or kinesthetic activities can really reinforce that learning. And you can even tell your students that the research shows they will learn better if they stretch beyond their preferences. There's actually some new research now in cognitive psychology that even shows if students have to work through difficulties and they have trouble processing the information, that they actually learn it better. That research paradigm is called desirable difficulties. So if you want to cite some research for your students as to why you're doing things in multiple ways, that's another research paradigm that you could take a look at. So this brings me to the first implication for instructor practice, which is the second section of the handout. I wanted to emphasize that instructors should avoid privileging the style of presenting information that's most comfortable for you. So use multiple pathways: visuals, written text, verbal explanations, and activities to communicate to your students. I know it's really easy to default to the mode of learning that's most comfortable for you, but try to stretch yourself as you're presenting information to students in different ways. And second, the second implication, you noted among yourselves the student differences in the U of M profile data, and I shared a little bit more data about how those student differences relate to student attitudes about campus climate. A key implication for teaching that follows from this is that whatever you teach, you can't assume that students bring the same learning preferences or academic preparation, identities, or experiences into the class as you, or even as the other students in the room. So in some ways, this is what keeps teaching interesting. It's more of a challenge or an intellectual puzzle to figure out how to shape an environment to reach all the students in your class. So I'm going to make my last kind of big thematic shift here. And for the remaining portion of this talk, I'd like to discuss several specific strategies particularly well-suited for structuring communication in the classroom so that you can enhance the learning of all of your students. I'm going to focus my remarks on 4 main points: clarifying assumptions, organizing material, engaging students, and checking learning. Before you can effectively communicate with students, you need to spend some time thinking about how you'll uncover the assumptions both you and your students bring to the classroom. And all of us bring assumptions into our classroom, assumptions which, if we don't check them or deal with them, can hinder the learning process. Of course, another way to check our assumptions and make them more visible is to use an organizational structure and organize our material to make assumptions and connections more explicit to students. In our conversations with students across campus at CRLT, we repeatedly hear that students want structure. And we know from the science of learning that experts, you all in your disciplines, can help novices, so the students who will be in your classrooms, develop meaningful knowledge structures through organizing the material. These organizational strategies are listed on the handout, so I'll walk through them, but some simple ways to organize include regularly doing a recap of the previous class session, and that can be done by you or even better yet by the students. Provide an outline at the beginning of class to let them know what you're going to cover, and then return to it at the end to remind them what's been done in class. To signal when you're addressing something that's particularly important, you can use visual cues. There's some dots here, but you can just circle or underline or bold, and also verbal cues like my first point or the author's key insight to help students follow the flow of the argument. This is actually crucial because students who are novices have a hard time separating the key points from the interesting details. So I know, being an instructor myself, really annoying to have a student raise their hand and say, is this going to be on the test? But what that question is really communicating to you is that students aren't able to discern what's important from what's not. It's also important to take time to make the connections between topics clear, and visual approaches can be really helpful in illustrating connections. So in addition to really simple things like drawing arrows, like is shown in this picture here, let me give just 2 other visual examples for making connections clear. You or even your students can create a concept map. This is a concept map of the concept of magnetism, which shows the link between topics. And concept maps can be used to give an overview of an individual class period, a unit, or even as a strategy for doing a review before exam time. And if you do like even a Google search of concept map and some topic that you're covering, there's lots of instructors who've shared useful concept maps that you can find and use in your classroom. Another visual strategy is a timeline. So that is a type of visual representation that can be helpful if you're organizing material in a way where chronology is particularly important. So to show students how topics, events, or scientific discoveries relate to one another in time. Another valuable organizational strategy is to provide a structured summary of nonlinear course experiences. And a good concrete example of that is something like just a classroom discussion for those of you, especially in the humanities and social sciences. A good discussion is inherently nonlinear. Topics merge and diverge and the conversation flows. But students report that they really love these engaging and interesting discussions, but we often hear from them that they don't know what to take away from the discussion, that it's really ephemeral, and they don't know what they need to know from that conversation. So it's important to save some time for a recap to review the main points of the day and how the discussion fits in with those main points. Lastly, it's also important to write down or even hand out important terms for your students, and that could be electronically or in hard copy. The research on note-taking tells us that students' ability to get specific terms and formulas written correctly in their notes is notoriously bad. And this is actually not surprising because note-taking it takes a lot of cognitive load. It's a complex process of listening and writing and summarizing all at the same time. This is why, for example, I provided you all with an outline handout that includes links to the research and key takeaway points from my talk. There's a really great overview of the note-taking research with strategies for students and instructors in CRLT Occasional Paper 16. So I'd encourage you to take a look at it on CRLT's website if this is something of interest to you. I want to turn now to my third communication strategy. The research on learning shows that those who are intrinsically motivated to learn the material are more likely to do so. So motivation matters for learning. And it may seem that intrinsic motivation is something that's fixed, but in fact, there are ways that instructors can increase student motivation by engaging students in the course material. Oops. This necessitates considering ways to make the material relevant to their lives or their career aspirations or major issues of the day. However, you'll recall earlier that the stereotype threat research I talked about in the first part of my talk suggests that it's particularly highly motivated students who encounter stereotype threat in academic settings, including, for example, but not limited to, women in STEM classrooms and African American students across academic settings. These students, the data shows, underperform due to the psychological toll that battling that stereotype threat takes on them. And this is true for graduate students as well. In fact, many of you might feel really anxious about your performance as an instructor. I know I was terrified the first time I was a GSI. So before giving strategies to increase student motivation, I want to give some strategies for mitigating stereotype threat and performance anxiety. So you can take a look at the last handout in today's session materials. Well, I guess it's the second to last, before the evaluation. It's entitled Strategies for Ensuring Success Under Stress. This is based on the research in cognitive and social psychology on stereotype threat and performance anxiety. And what I'd like to do is just give you several minutes to read these strategies for success, and I'll note that I'll be returning to these at the end of my talk and asking you to apply them and think critically about them. So you'll kind of be doing that later on, but for now, just read them and digest them, think about what might be particularly useful for you. Okay, so now that you've considered many strategies for mitigating anxiety that either could be a barrier to your performance as an instructor or to your students academically, I want to share some other strategies to engage students and increase motivation in your class. A useful approach is to provide a wide variety of concrete examples of the phenomena you're studying, examples supplied by you or better yet by the students themselves, and that accomplishes two goals. to challenge or broaden the students' initial understandings of that phenomena and to increase their chances of connecting to the material. A good example of this in practice is the sociology instructor who asks students to identify an image, a video, or some musical clip that illustrated the key concept from every theoretical reading in the course. Another approach is to build in opportunities to connect to the students' life and career goals. So for example, there was an environmental journalism class where students who hoped to go into the journalism profession participated in a pitch fest, is what the instructor called it. And there was a panel of local journalists for whom they pitched their environmental journalism ideas. And this really got students motivated to come up with excellent ideas. Finally, no matter how skilled you are at these various strategies, that doesn't necessarily mean learning has taken place. On your handout, under the section on checking learning, there's a quote that really drives this home by Angelo and Cross, who wrote an excellent book on assessing learning. They said, "Teaching without learning is just talking."